Sheep farming or cattle farming in South Africa, which one is actually better for beginners? The truth is, there is no single correct answer. It really depends on your budget, your land, and what your long-term goals are. So in this video, I'm going to break it down in a simple and practical way so you can decide which direction makes sense for you. Let's start with one of the biggest factors, and that is startup cost. Sheep farming is generally the more accessible option for beginners. You can start small even with just a few animals. A single sheep can cost anywhere from around 1,200 Rand to 2,500 Rand, depending on the breed and quality. What this means is you can realistically start a small sheep farming operation with something like 10,000 to 20,000 Rand if you plan carefully. But here's where most beginners make a mistake. It's not just about buying the sheep. You also need to think about feed, especially during dry seasons. You need to consider basic medication like deworming and vaccinations. You will also need some form of fencing or kraal setup, and basic handling or identification tools. So even though sheep farming has a lower entry cost, you still need to plan properly and not just focus on the animal price. Now when we compare that to cattle farming, it becomes a completely different level. Cattle farming requires much more capital from the start. One good quality cow can cost several thousand Rand, and breeding animals or bulls can cost even more. Because of that, you cannot realistically start cattle farming with a very small budget. On top of the animal cost, you also need stronger fencing, larger handling facilities, and a lot more land and water availability. So in simple terms, sheep farming has a low barrier to entry, while cattle farming requires significantly more capital and infrastructure. Now let's talk about land requirements, because this is another major difference. Sheep farming is more flexible when it comes to land. You can farm sheep on relatively small land areas. A general guideline is about 1 to 2 sheep per hectare, depending on grazing quality. In good grazing conditions, you might carry more animals, but in dry areas, you need to be more conservative. This makes sheep farming a good option for smaller farms or emerging farmers who are still building up. However, overgrazing is a real risk if you push your land too hard, so management is very important. Cattle farming, on the other hand, requires much more land. Cattle eat more per animal, they need stronger pasture systems, and they put more pressure on grazing. If you overstock cattle on small land, you will quickly run into problems like land degradation and poor animal condition. So in simple terms, sheep are more land efficient, while cattle are more land intensive. Now let's talk about profit potential, because this is where most people get interested. Sheep farming is not necessarily about making big money per animal. It is more about faster turnover. Sheep reproduce relatively quickly, and you can grow your flock faster compared to cattle. This allows you to generate income more frequently through lamb sales and flock expansion. So sheep farming is generally better for faster cash flow cycles, especially when you are starting out. The downside is that the profit per animal is lower compared to cattle. Cattle farming works differently. Each animal carries a much higher value, so when you sell a cow or a bull, the income per transaction is significantly higher. However, cattle take longer to reproduce and grow, so your money is tied up for longer periods before you see returns. So in simple terms, sheep farming gives you faster money movement, while cattle farming gives you bigger money per sale, but slower cycles. Now let's look at management and risk, because this is where many beginners underestimate things. Sheep are more sensitive animals. They are more vulnerable to diseases, and they are also more exposed to predators. Because of that, they require closer daily monitoring. You need to check your flock regularly, make sure water is always available, and quickly identify any sick or weak animals. Proper identification is also very important in sheep farming, because it helps you track performance and losses more accurately. Cattle are generally more resilient. They can handle tougher conditions and require less day-to-day attention compared to sheep. But the important thing to understand is that when something goes wrong with cattle, the financial loss per animal is much higher. So sheep farming requires more hands-on management, while cattle farming requires stronger financial protection per animal. Now, if you are trying to decide which one is right for you, here is a simple way to think about it. You should consider sheep farming if you have limited startup capital, if you want to start small and grow gradually, if you want faster turnover, and if you are still learning livestock management. You should consider cattle farming if you have access to more land, if you have higher startup capital, if you are focused on long-term asset building, and if you have larger scale operations. The most important insight is this: there is no better option overall. There is only what fits your situation right now. In fact, many successful farmers in South Africa start with sheep to build experience and cash flow, and then move into cattle later when they are ready to scale. So it's not really sheep versus cattle. In many cases, it becomes sheep first, cattle later. And finally, if you are serious about getting into livestock farming, one of the most overlooked things is proper identification and tracking. At Duratag, we help farmers manage and identify their livestock properly from day one, so they can reduce losses and improve control. If you need help, you can WhatsApp us on 077 433 6080 or check out Duratag. Thank you for watching this video. We'll see you in the next one.